Selling six-figure copies in a week is a special thing that has only been done by 23 albums in history. In this video, we'll go on a journey through the albums that made history by selling more than 1 million copies in just 1 week. The concept of selling 1 million copies in a week wasn't always a common occurrence before Nielsen Music started tracking album sales accurately in 1991. After that, the first album to be verified by Nielsen to move 1 million units in the US in a single week was The Bodyguard soundtrack by Whitney Houston. It was released on November 17, 1992. As the soundtrack to the movie starring Whitney and Kevin Costner. The album sold 1 million copies in a week, ending January 3, 1993, 6 weeks after its release. It has now sold more than 45 million copies worldwide, and has been certified 18 times platinum in the US, which makes it the best-selling soundtrack of all time. The next album to achieve the million milestone in a week was Double Live by Garth Brooks. It was released on November 17, 1998 as a 2-disc compilation of live songs recorded during his 1996-98 world tour. It broke the first week sales record at the time, selling 1 million copies in its first week. Next was Millennium by Backstreet Boys. It was released on May 18, 1999 during the boy band boom of the late 90s. It sold 1.1 million copies in its first week. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and stayed there for 10 non-consecutive weeks. NSYNC was next up in the boy band era with their album No Strings Attached, which was released on March 21, 2000. It was their third album and the first album to sell more than 2 million records in a week when it sold 2.4 million copies in its debut week. Next was a classic from the pop princess, Oops, I Did It Again by Britney Spears. It was coming off the hype of her debut album, and it sold 1.3 million copies in its first week. It became the fastest selling album by a female artist at the time. It has now been certified diamond by the RIAA. 2000 was the year for huge album sales, and next was the Marshall Mathers LP by Eminem, which was released on May 23, 2000. It was the album that cemented Eminem's legacy, coming after the success of the Slim Shady LP. It sold 1.7 million copies in its first week. The album has now been certified 11 times platinum in the US. Next was Chocolate Starfish and Hot Dog Flavored Water by Limp Bizkit. Limp Bizkit was at the forefront of the nu metal rap crossover of the early 2000s with bands like Linkin Park. The album was released on October 17, 2000 as their third album. It sold more than 1 million copies in its first week. Backstreet Boys came back to the Million Club with their album Black and Blue, which was released on November 21, 2000. They became the first act to have back-to-back 1 million selling albums when Black and Blue sold 1.5 million copies in its first week. It was certified 8 times platinum in the US by the end of 2000. Next was a greatest hits album by a legendary band, One by the Beatles. It was released on November 13, 2000. It's a compilation album that contains the biggest hits of the 60s by the Beatles. The album sold 1.2 million copies in a week ending December 24, 2000, 6 weeks after its release. It is still selling after 2 decades, being certified 11 times platinum by the RIAA. Next was Celebrity by NSYNC. It was released on July 24, 2001 as the boy band's fourth and last album. It sold an astounding 1.8 million copies in its first week. It had the second best debut week sales at the time, behind their last album. It was a huge cultural moment for the early 2000s. Next was an album full of NSYNC disses, The Eminem Show by Eminem, which was released on May 26, 2000. Eminem ruled the early 2000s as a counterculture to the pop stars that were popping up at the time. It was his fourth album, and it suffered from being pirated on the internet, but it sold 1.3 million copies in its first week. It has now sold more than 27 million copies worldwide, which makes it one of the best-selling albums of all time. Next to the Million Club was Feels Like Home by Norah Jones. It was released on February 10, 2004 as Nora's sophomore album. It's a country and folk jazz album, so it was surprising when it sold more than 1 million copies in its first week. It ended 2004 as the second best-selling album in the US with 3.8 million copies sold. Next is the first R&B album on the list, Confessions by Usher. It was released on March 23, 2004. It was an album filled with hits, with 5 top 10 singles and 4 of them hitting number 1. The album sold more than 1 million copies in its first week. It has sold pretty well since then now certified 14 times platinum in the US. Next on the list is The Massacre by 50 Cent. It was released on the 3rd of March 2005, after the hype of his debut album Get Rich or Die Trying, which is a classic. The Massacre sold 1.1 million copies in the first week after its release. Hip-hop was dominating in the late 2000s, when the next album to that milestone was The Carter 3 by Lil Wayne. It was released on June 10, 2008 as his 6th album. It sold 400,000 copies just in its opening day, and ending the week accumulating 1 million copies. It ended 2008 as the best-selling album of the year. Next was the first Taylor Swift album to the Million Club, Speak Now. It was released on October 25, 2010 as Taylor's 3rd album. She was still in her country era, and the album sold more than 1 million copies in its first week. Next was another pop royalty, Lady Gaga, with her album Born This Way. It was released on May 23, 2011 as a follow-up to the famed Monster. The album sold 1.1 million copies in its first week and ended 2011 as the best-selling album of the year. Next was Red by Taylor Swift. It was released on October 22, 2012 as her 4th album. When this album sold 1.2 million copies in its first week, Taylor became the first solo female artist with 2 million selling weeks in the US, a record which she kept extending. Next is the Pop Bible 1989 by Taylor Swift. It was released on October 27, 2014 as her 5th album. It sold 1.2 million copies in its first week. It ended up spawning 5 top 10 hits, with 3 of them hitting number 1. It became her biggest album, now certified 9 times platinum and eligible for a lot more. Next was 25 by Adele. It was released on November 20, 2015 as a follow-up to the best-selling album of the 2010s, 21. 25 ended the decade as the 2nd biggest. It sold 3.3 million copies just in its first week, which is still the single-week record for album sales. It went on to sell 1.1 million copies in its 2nd week and 1.1 million copies in its 5th week. It remains the only album in history to sell more than 1 million copies in 3 different weeks. Next was Reputation by Taylor Swift. It was released on November 10, 2017 as her 6th album. It sold 1.2 million album equivalent units in its first week. It ended 2017 as the 2nd best-selling album in the world, with 4.5 million copies sold. Taylor continued her run with Midnights, which was released on October 21, 2022. It was her 10th studio album, and a dawn of a new era. It broke Spotify records when it was released, and sold 1.5 million copies in its first week. It ended 2022 and 2023 as the 2nd best-selling album in both years. Taylor has always sold records, but it feels like she picked up another gear in the 2020s. Of course, the next album in the Million Club was 1989 Taylor's Version by Taylor Swift. It was released on October 27, 2023 as the re-recorded version of her 2014 album. It had a better first week than the original, selling 1.6 million copies and becoming Taylor's biggest debut in the US. It became her record-breaking 6th album to sell more than 1 million copies in its first week. Which album did you listen to the most? Tell me in the comments below.